Hello and welcome to the lecture on purpose of constructor. So we have understood what is constructor and how to define and execute a constructor. Let's take a step back and understand what are the purposes of constructor. When do you basically use them? The first use case of constructor is really to initialize the property of a class. So if you have defined some properties and you want to make sure before any of the operation happen on those properties, you want to initialize them with a default value. And the safest place is basically the constructor, and it's basically a good practice that you should use a constructor, because if you give your code to some other developer or you are sharing this code in the community, everyone will understand constructor, and the main purpose of the constructor is basically to initialize the property of a class. So if you are initializing something in the constructor, it's basically a good sign to tell everybody that this is the important thing that you have to do in order for other functions of that class to execute. Okay, so remember, when you have a reason for initializing the properties of a class, you should always do it in a constructor. That is the right place to do it. Then you can initialize the database connection. So when you want to connect to a database, the first step is you make sure you have a valid connection. Okay, you can do it via the constructor. So if you have a function to fetch the records and to display the records, the way you can initialize the connection of the database is from the constructor. So when someone create the instance of that class, and once they do the instance of a class, they have a valid connection for that instance, and using that instance of the class or the object, they can start making the query right away. Okay, so they don't have to explicitly make a connection with another method. It's already embedded maybe into the constructor. That's a good place for you to initialize the database connections. Another good place is to check if the file exists. Let's say you are writing a file utility, and that file utility basically reads all the file contents and basically can perform some kind of search. So before you do some operations from that methods of a class, constructor is a good place to check whether the file exists or not, and then you can put indicators everywhere in the program to say the file doesn't exist. Okay, and then you can stop the user for every method to check that variable and say the file doesn't exist. It's also a good place for you to check whether some of the resources are exist or not. Then open the file before using it with the methods. Check for internet connection. That's a very good example of using constructor. Check API is reachable before the connection. Load an instance of a class. Let's say your class is using some other classes, right? Then this constructor will be a good place for you to create an instance of an other class, so that you have a valid instance before the actual class methods are being executed. Okay, so you will try to learn and understand all these concepts when you start learning new things in OOPS, and we'll try to do more and more examples. Then you'll try to see the benefits of a constructor. Okay, and loading mandatory properties to execute the method in the class. Well, these are the main purpose of why you should write a constructor, and what are the use cases of using some of the things inside the constructor. Okay, so that's all on the lecture for purpose of the constructor. I'll see you in the next one.